السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
All right. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. All praise is due to Allah. We worship Him, we ask His protection, and no one forgives except Allah. And we bear witness that Allah is the only one worthy of worship, and we bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is His last prophet and messenger. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. O you who believe, fear Allah and worship Him as He should be worshipped and feared, and do not die only except in a state of Iman. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah wa kafa. Wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina astafa. خصوصا على سيدنا ورسوله وخاتم الأنبياء وعلى آله الأزكياء وأصحابه الأتقياء أما بعد. اللهم إنا نسألك حبك وحب من يحبك وحب عمل يقربنا إلى حبك يا رب العالمين. Welcome back everybody to to our second session of Solar Compass. Now, who remembers why we called it Solar Compass? Before I pick on him. Yes, Amin.
So I just checked my notes. Yeah, it was talking about how, like you need to when you teach about Islam, like you refer to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was talking about love people, like if you want to teach somebody, you have to love them.
Okay, but why do we call it Solar Compass?
Because it's about the soul. It's supposed to motivate the soul, and you need to change your intentions, good intentions.
Naam, mashallah. Thank you, Amin. We called our session Solar Compass, and this whole series we're calling it Solar Compass. And the reason being is many of us, we attend many lectures and many halaqas, right? And many of you come to the Wednesday lectures, right? And the thing is, all these lectures that we go to and we attend will not do us any benefit if what's inside here is not correct. If your soul is not on a proper path, none of it will do you any good. You get what I'm saying? So we can talk about the Day of Judgment, we can talk about the Graveyard series, we can talk about riba, we can talk about Jannah, we can talk about Jahannam all day long. We can talk about haram and halal all day long. But none of it means anything if this right here isn't sound, if your heart isn't proper. Naam. And I'm taking a course right now with Qalam, which is called Tazkiyah and Aqidah. And I explained last week that Aqidah is very necessary for us to learn. Aqidah is your pillars. That's what everything stands on in Islam. Naam. But many of the scholars say Aqidah and Tazkiyah go hand in hand, because you're constantly purifying yourself. And tazkiyah, as we mentioned last week, comes from the word zakat. When you give zakat, when you're giving money, you're purifying your wealth. So tazkiyah is that of purifying oneself, one's nafs, right? And we're going to be going based off the book by Imam Abu Hamd Alghazali called ayuha, alwalad, which means my dear disciple, or my dear son. Ayuha, alwalad. Now this book came about when Imam Alghazali, I gave a long explanation about who he was, and I'm not going to dive deep into it. But Imam Alghazali, he was one of the best scholars of his time, to the point that they put him on the top of the top. He was in charge of all Islamic academic affairs of the Muslim world at the time. Imam Alghazali decides to disappear. Remember, we used the analogy? Imagine you reach the highest levels of fame, and then Umar Sulaiman deletes his Instagram account. He's gone. Nobody can find where Umar Sulaiman is. Yeah? Imam Alghazali deleted his Instagram account 1400 years or 1000 years ago. Yeah? And he's dead. Nobody can find where Imam Alghazali is. And he went on this journey purely, and this is where his famous work, Ihya Ulum al-Din, revival of the Islamic sciences, came. which is 6 volumes, 300 pages a volume, came about. And Imam Alghazali saw that many people were learning knowledge for the wrong reasons. He saw that many people wanting to learn the deen just so they can have a position in society and have pay and whatever the case may be, which is completely exactly what's happening today. Yeah? So he disappeared for some time, then returned back to his hometown, and he had some students and where he taught for years and years and years, and one of his students studied with him for 20 years. Now I highly recommend everybody, before I dive deep and give a recap of last week, if you don't have a notebook or something to write your notes on, I highly recommend you to get something and do it. If you don't have one with you today, pull out your phone and do it. Because I promise you, ilm and knowledge doesn't just come and immediately you memorize every word. And a lot of the times after we leave, it's forgotten. So please, when you find something beneficial, write it down in your notes or whatever the case may be. Get in the habit of it. And I would prefer you guys not to use your phones, but if you guys, that's all you have today, that's fine. Invest, like I said last week, invest in a small notebook like this. Every time you go to a lecture, have this with you. Keep it in your car. Keep it in your backpack. And fill it up with just nothing but notes. Everywhere you go, just nothing but your Islamic notes, and it'll help you out. Whenever you're looking for something in the future, it'll help you out. You say, hey, okay, you can put your little sticky notes, okay, we talked about this is what this ayah refers to, whatever the case may be. Invest in something, okay? Because this series is what's going to help you, inshallah. Get this and check yourself on the right path. Yes, the Day of Judgment series is important, the Graveyard series is important, but a lot of the stuff we talk about today is what's going to help you in that grade. Now, so we covered 2 pieces of advice last week for those who missed it, right? A student of Imam Alghazali wrote to him and he went to him and he said, he started thinking and pondering upon himself. And he says, ثُمَّ إِنَّهُ تَفَكَّرَ يَوْمًا فِي حَالِ نَفْسِهِ وَخَطَرَ عَلَى بَالِهِ وَقَالَ. On one day, this student was thinking and reflecting upon himself. He was thinking and reflecting. And he said to himself, إني قرأت أنواعا من العلوم وصرفت ريعان عمري على تعلمها وجمعها. I've spent years upon years learning sciences and knowledge, right? And I've spent so much memorizing it and writing it. But now I've come to a point. والآن ينبغي لي أن أعلم أي نوعها ينفعني غدا. Now it occurred to me finally, which of all this knowledge that I have, all these sciences that I've learned, what will help me tomorrow? Tomorrow meaning what? Sunday. Huh? The hereafter, yes. So tomorrow meaning the hereafter. But here's the important thing. He says, وَيَنْفَعُنِي غَدًا وَيُوَنِّسْنِي فِي قَبْرِي. Which of the knowledge will help me in my grave, will be there with me in my grave? Yeah? So he said, I wrote to my shaykh, my imam, my teacher, Hujjatul Islam, Imam Alghazali, the proof of Islam. That was his nickname. The proof, the evidence of Islam. Imagine. He said, I wrote to my shaykh. And I told him, he said, مقصودي أن يكتب الشيخ حاجتي في ورقات تكون معي مدة حياتي. So my whole point is I'm writing my shaykh so he can write me a few points that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Few points that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Right? وأعمل بما فيها مدة عمري. And not that I just have these points, but I act upon these points for the rest of my life. Okay? And he wrote to the shaykh. The shaykh replies back to him and sends him multiple letters, 18 different points of advice. The first point of advice, he goes, اعلم أيها الولد المحب العزيز. What was the lesson we derived out of this first line? What's the first lesson we got out of this first line? اعلم أيها الولد المحب العزيز, which means, know my dear beloved son, the one who's so beloved to me, the one who's so noble to me. This is the Imam writing to his student. What is the first thing we learn from that line? Be nice and loving. He's a sheikh, imam, the best of his time. And look how he reacts and talks to his students. And my dear beloved son, the one who's so beloved to me. Yeah? Somebody's coming to ask him for advice. He doesn't look down upon them. He doesn't push them to the side, but he's giving them, just starting it off with just great vibes. Yeah? And then he continues. He says, أَطَالَ اللَّهُ بَقَاكَ بِطَاعَتِهِ وَسَلَكَ بِكَ سَبِيلَ أَحِبَّائِهِ. He says, may Allah long your days in obedience to Him, and that you travel with you, and He travels with you on the path of those who He loves. So the first part is, he's showing love to his student. What's the second part? What is he doing?
He's wishing good for him.
Making dua for him. He's making dua for him. Perfect. And then he says, now this is the sarcasm of Imam Alghazali. Like we mentioned last week, he's sharp with his sarcasm, yeah? And he goes, أن منشور النصيحة يكتب من معدن رسول الله من معدن الرسالة. He says that all the advice I give you will come from the message of the Prophet Muhammad. Everything I'm going to give you is going to come from the Prophet Muhammad. Okay? إن كان قد بلغك منه نصيحة. And if you've heard about the Prophet, and you've studied with me, and you've learned for the last 20 years, and that message of the Prophet ﷺ has reached you, right? This is what he says. فَأَيُّ حَاجَةٍ لَكَ فِي نَصِيحَتِي. If you know about the Prophet, and you've learned about him, then why are you asking me? I ain't got nothing for you. Everything I'm going to give you is going to come from him. And you've studied him. So there's nothing for me to give you. And then he says, وَإِن لَمْ يَبْلُغْكَ فَقُلْ لِي مَاذَا حَصَّلْتَ فِي هَذِهِ السِّنِينَ الْمَاضِيَةِ. And if you haven't, if the message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ hasn't reached you, then what have you been doing in the last 20 years? What you've been doing with your time? First piece of advice. That's the first point he gives him. Right? That, what have you been doing? So he's a little bit tough with a little bit of sarcasm, but he's also showing love and making dua. Okay? Second piece of advice, he goes, again, every piece of advice, he starts it off how? How did we say he starts his advice?
Ya ayuha alwalad.
Ya ayuha alwalad, my dear beloved son. Every single advice he gives. So next advice, he goes straight to diving into the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. He goes, من جملة ما نصح به رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أمته قوله عليه السلام علامة إعراض الله تعالى عن العبد اشتغاله بما لا يعنيه. He goes, يا أيها الولد, my dear beloved son, I'm going to go straight into hadith. And I'm going to give you advice that the Prophet ﷺ gave to his ummah. Advice that he gave to his ummah. Now here's what he says. He says, from one of the signs, an indication of Allah neglecting you, or maybe the better word would say withdrawing Himself from your life. That's the better word. Allah withdrawing Himself from your life. Okay? Is that He makes you busy with things that don't matter and have nothing to do with you. Hadith Sahih in Bukhari and Muslim, by the way. That this is a sign that Allah has neglected you and withdrawn Himself from you, is the fact that He makes you busy with things that don't even matter. What do we do today? Who likes wasting time here? Does anybody raise your hand if you like wasting time? Please. Okay, 2 people. Any sisters? You want to be as stupid as these guys? You guys, I gave you guys nobody likes wasting their time. Nobody likes it. Don't waste my time. But here's the thing. Does anybody waste their time here? Nobody. Yahya is saying, I never waste my time. Anybody waste their time? Everyone wastes their time. How do we waste our time? Carmi?
Hey, why you pointing at me?
I'm a part of the group, bro. How do we waste our time? The phone, the social media, hours and hours and hours and hours we spend on social media with things that mean nothing to me and you, and that don't affect us. All these hours. Do you think that's a sign that Allah has been neglecting you? If you really think about it, this is what the hadith says. Yeah? And then here's what he goes. Now he pulls this from a weaker narration, and he says, وَإِنْ إِمْرِئٍ ذَهَبَتْ سَاعَةٌ مِّنْ عُمْرِهِ في غير ما خلق له من العبادة لجدير أن تطول عليه حسرته. And if there's a person who waste just an hour on this dunya, the only thing they're doing is making their grief on the day of judgment longer. That's all they're doing to themselves. Each hour you waste here, you're wasting, or you're making your grief longer on the day of judgment. Each hour. And then he says, وَمَنْ جَاوَزَ الْأَرْبَعِينَ وَلَمْ يَغْلِبْ خَيْرُهُ عَلَى شَرِّهِ فَلْيَتَجَهَّزْ إِلَى النَّارِ وَفِي هَذِهِ النَّصِيحَةِ كِفَايَةٌ لِأَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ. And whomever passes 40 years old, and they find themselves that every day they do more bad than good. Every day. Then he says, I got bad news for you, brother. It's over with. Because think about it, once you get to 40, it's hard to break all those habits. I'm not saying it can't be done. He's not saying it can't be done. Inshallah. Y'all ain't getting a break. So, but it's hard once you hit 40 years old and you're used to doing bad every day, more than good. It's going to be very hard for you to change your habits. Very hard for you to change your habits. So he's saying if you get to 40 and you haven't done something, you got yourself some deep stuff. So those are the first two pieces of advice. Now the new session which we're starting today, this is where he starts. How does he start every advice? What does he say? Ya ayuha alwalad. Not ya walad. Ya ayuha alwalad. Ya ayuha alwalad. My dear beloved son. He says, oh, this is beautiful. I'm not even reading from my notes. Okay. He says, Ya ayuha alwalad, an-nasihatu sahlatun. Advice is easy. Does everybody agree advice is easy? Yeah?
What's the student's name?
We don't know the students. He's just a student of Imam Alghazali.
Is he the student that was with him for 20 years? Or?
Yep. Student who was with him for 20 years. He says, Ya ayuha alwalad, an-nasihatu sahlatun. He says, giving advice is easy. Sah? Giving advice is easy. Because how many of you guys here have an opinion? Raise your hand if you have an opinion. Everybody should raise their hand. Who thinks it's cold in the room? Raise your hand. Who thinks it's cold right now? Okay. Who thinks it's just right? The temperature is perfect. Who thinks it's a little too hot? Okay. So that means we all have opinions. We all have an opinion. Now here's the thing. He says, giving advice is easy. وَالْمُشْكِلُ قُبُولُهَا. Advice is easy. Guys, please stop playing with your chips and your bottles and stuff like that. It irritates me, I'm sorry. But he says, giving advice is very easy. But the problem is accepting advice. The problem is accepting advice. Now, how many of you guys, maybe some of you guys have friends or whatever it may be, you guys are constantly advising, but it's just not clicking. And parents know exactly how that feels. You're giving advice, and the kid falls in the same trap over and over and over again. Yeah? And when you advise constantly, eventually what happens to you? Peace out. I don't want to deal with this no more. Nah? So, he says, this is why advice is hard. لِأَنَّهَا فِي مَذَاقِ مُتَّبِعِ الْهَوَى مُرْبَى. He says, for those who like following their pleasures and their desires, it's bitter advice. It's a tough pill to swallow. It's a tough pill. Yahi, wake up and pray Fajr. Man, I only slept 3 hours last night. They're following their desire because they want to sleep. Sleep is tough. And you need sleep. But waking up is even tougher. So he's saying this is bitter advice because it's hard for people to leave their desires. That's the bitter truth of it. Okay? Especially إِذْ الْمَنَاهِ مَحْبُوبَةٌ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ. Especially if the haram is beloved in their heart. Especially if the haram is beloved in their heart, then it will be very hard for somebody to accept advice. Especially if haram is in their heart and they love doing haram. And this is what he says next. This is what's going to shock a lot of people. Before I dive into what he says, imagine you have a close friend. Maybe some of you guys have been through this. You guys have a close friend where you're constantly advising, brother, come with me to the masjid, let's go pray, let's go attend halaqah, let's do this, let's do that, right? Ya you need to stop doing this, ya you need to stop smoking, you need to stop drinking, whatever the case may be, nah? And that person just doesn't want to listen. But what's worse about it, not just for the normal people, but he says the hard part is وعلى الخصوص لمن كان طالب العلم. Advice is bitter and hardest for those to accept those who are students of knowledge. They're the most stubborn. Hard to give them advice. And my teacher brought up a really good point. And Imam Alghazali's work makes you reflect on yourself. What's the reason you all are here today? What's the reason? To gain knowledge, now. So you all are students of knowledge. Not just from me, but students of knowledge from everybody around you, students of knowledge of life, students from everything. But he's referring to the students of knowledge of what? The deen, the religion. So he's saying that there's nobody more stubborn than somebody that reads 2 pages of a book and thinks he knows everything now. 2 pages. Oh yeah, I learned in class. Da, 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 da. That's it. And now they think they can talk and speak about every matter. Or you know what Sheikh calls them Instagram knowledge, students of knowledge. They see a nice little quote, boop, take a picture on my story. Bro, your 13 followers don't care. I promise you. But here's the thing though. That's when you gotta check yourself. Like, why am I doing this? Why am I here today? Why am I going to Qalam? What's happening? You know, me and Fawad, right before we came here, we were speaking about this. Like, what's our intention? What am I studying for? To give lectures? What's the reason I'm studying? What's the reason I'm going to Qalam? What's the reason he's going to Markash or anybody's going to any other, school? What's the reason that you come to these? Who's it for? Is it because your friends are dragging you? Or because I had to message you and tell you to come? What is it? Right? So he's saying advice is the worst and the hardest for those who are students of knowledge, meaning all of us here in the room. And he continues to say, and that just, to me, when I was reading this, I wasn't expecting the Imam to say this, because I'm like, okay, we're students of knowledge, we're learning this book, but he's directing everything to us. He's not talking about your average person. He's talking about everybody who's trying to learn and attain knowledge. Nah? So he says, here's the reason why. He says, فَإِنَّهُ يَحْسَبُ أَنَّ الْعِلْمَ المجرد له سيكون نجاته وخلاصه فيه وأنه مستغن عن العمل. He says that this person, the reason why the student of knowledge is so tough to advise, because they think just because now they have knowledge, they know things, they don't need anybody to tell them anything. Na'am, right? And he thinks that this knowledge is going to be sufficient for them. They think that this knowledge that they have is sufficient. Yeah, I give lectures, I'm good. I go to school, I'm studying, I read books, it's sufficient for me. It's enough. Right? And he continues to say, he says, لا يعلم هذا المغرور أنه حين حصل العلم إذا لم يعمل به تكون الحجة عليه آكلا. He says, this person, this weak-minded person, who's learning all this knowledge, does he not know that all this knowledge means nothing if you're not acting upon it? If somebody's telling you you need to pray 5 times a day, but you yourself aren't praying 5 times a day, it's a problem. Right? You're not acting upon it. But he says, here's the next part, and this is the scary part. He says, يَكُونُ حُجَّةٌ. What did he say? He says, تَكُونُ الْحُجَّةُ عَلَيْهِ آكَدًا. The proof and the evidence of this knowledge will be used against you on the day of judgment. Meaning, anytime you learn a piece of knowledge, anything you learn today, and you go home and you don't act upon it, it will be a proof against you on the day of judgment. Now you have the evidence. And if you're not using the evidence, you're doing what? You're neglecting it, which means it'll be an evidence against you on the day of judgment. Imagine. Every lecture you've listened to, every class I've taken, every halaqah I've attended, if I'm not acting and truly believing that knowledge, but using it and using it and acting with it, it's against me on the day of judgment. And he continues to say, he says, that's why our teacher taught us, says that's why you always say, Allahumma ij'al hadha al-Qur'an wal-ilm hujjatan lana wa laysa alayna. Oh Allah, make this knowledge that we're learning, that the Qur'an we're reading, be a proof for us on the day of judgment, not evidence against us on the day of judgment. Now, and he says, كما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أشد الناس عذابا يوم القيامة عالم لا ينفعه الله بعلمه. The punishment is the most severe on the one who's attained the knowledge but doesn't act upon the knowledge. That's the punishment. Imagine all this knowledge we learn. We're going to be the first to be called up. We're going to be the first to be questioned. And all this knowledge that we boast about, and I go to Qalam and I go to this school and I study this and I give halaqah and I give this, but I'm not acting upon it, the punishment will be the most severe on this person. Now cope with that. Everything that you've learned will be a hujjah against you. Especially if you're neglecting it and not acting upon it. And what's worse is for those who are giving that nasihah. Those who are teaching it and they don't act upon it. That's the toughest pill to swallow. Pizza time? Okay, quick pizza time and then we'll come back inshallah. Actually, yeah.